Up until now in the Western world, most philosophy degrees or programs focus only on the study of Western philosophies, from the pre-Socratics to Aquinas, then to Kant and Wittgenstein. Little emphasis is put on mentioning philosophies from other cultures, primarily Eastern philosophies. It is my belief that rigorous pursuit of philosophy should encompass opportunities to study all types of philosophies. I hope that with this program, I can further stimulate interest in Eastern philosophy and show that they in fact do have approaches similar to those in the West. In this program, my primary focus would be to compare Western existentialism of Husserl and Sartre to Eastern Buddhism. I recognize that Buddhism is a very complex tradition, with many different schools and diverging doctrines. However, by focusing on the early Theravada tradition, I hope that a comparison can be made with the fundamentals of Buddhism, the core doctrines, rather than the diverging interpretations that are still debated within the different Buddhist traditions. My main task then is to compare Sartre's non-egological philosophy with the Buddhist theory of selflessness. In this process, we will examine the theories of self that are rejected by both Sartre and the Buddhist, and see how both go on to develop selflessness theories that pose a direct challenge to their predecessors. For Sartre, this involves his rejection of Husserl's Transcendental Ego; for the Buddhist, the rejection of the Vedanta philosophy of Atman. Similarities and differences would then be raised concerning both selflessness theories. Sartre had many predecessors that supported a theory of self. One of them was Kant. Kant introduced the concept of the pure ego as something that would unify our consciousness, or more specifically, all our conscious experiences. This was his theory of the transcendental unity of self-consciousness. According to Kant, consciousness of objects is always accompanied by a unity of consciousness, that is, all empirical consciousness belongs to one and the same transcendental consciousness which is expressed in the proposition, I think. It is in some sense similar to Descartes' cogito ergo sum, in that the sole conception of thinking implies a subject to which the thinking is taking place, then, a subject that unifies the thinking experience. Kant also emphasizes a distinction between his pure ego and something he calls the empirical ego. According to him, the pure ego only plays the role as a unifying principle of consciousness and does not involve anything else. The empirical ego, on the other hand, is responsible for self-identity. With the aid of the empirical world, we experience and learn about ourselves, who we are, distinctive properties that distinguishes ourselves from others, in other words, our enduring personal identity. These conscious experiences are then unified by the pure ego to constitute the empirical ego. We can thus understand the pure ego to be the act of determining, and the empirical ego as that which is determined, namely knowledge of oneself. It is important to note here that without the pure ego, the formulation of the empirical ego would be impossible. That is, without the pure ego acting to unify consciousness, no empirical ego can be formulated. Personal identity would be impossible, as one would never realize that the seemingly distinct conscious experiences actually belong to a unified one. In logical investigations, Husserl initially rejected Kant's pure ego, as he found no need to introduce a unifier for consciousness. However, in his later works, as in Ideas, he reverses his position and accepts the concept of the pure ego, which he conceptualizes and names the transcendental ego. According to him now, in order to explain the directedness of all conscious acts, a unity of consciousness is needed, a concept he names the immanent directedness. With this realization, he introduces the transcendental ego as the unifier for such conscious acts, and formulates his own phenomenological structure of the world. Husserl's phenomenological structure is a three-way relationship between the transcendental ego, consciousness, and some intentional object. According to Husserl, consciousness is always a consciousness of an intentional object. and the transcendental ego is always the unity pole for which consciousness arises. Thus he concludes that the transcendental ego lies inside consciousness, and always projects itself towards some intentional object. On the surface, it might appear that both theories of self from Kant and Husserl are in fact identical. But this is far from the truth. One obvious difference is the treatment of the self in both theories. For Kant, the pure ego is treated as a transcendental presupposition, something that cannot be contained and reflected upon in the data of our experience. Unlike Kant, however, Husserl's transcendental ego is treated as a phenomenological datum. I quote, "It is for Husserl the condition of the possibility of experience is all right, but is yet somehow contained in the data, something which is ipso facto impossible in Kant's view. For Husserl, the transcendental ego can be contained in the data of our experience. This is possible through what he calls the transcendental phenomenological reflection, which itself is a phenomenological reduction of the empirical self and external world. According to Husserl, when one performs phenomenological reduction, which is reflective by nature, the empirical self and the whole world is suspended from our experience. What remains is a direct experience of the pure transcendental ego, rendering it as something we can experience. Now we can understand why the pure ego for Husserl is named the transcendental ego. For Husserl, acts of consciousness are typically always consciousness of the same intentional stream of conscious experience. This stream of consciousness he names immanence. However, there are conscious acts that are intentional to objects beyond the stream, beyond immanence. The pure ego is one of them. Through phenomenological reduction, the pure ego is experienced and posited beyond immanence. Thus it is named the transcendental ego, in the sense of it being transcendental of immanence. Husserl's transcendental ego and phenomenological structure was completely rejected by Sartre in the transcendence of the ego. For Husserl, intentionality of some intentional object was an essential feature of consciousness. However, for Sartre, intentionality was in fact consciousness itself. All consciousness aims at are things that are beyond itself. It is always directed outwards, thus nothing is within consciousness itself, including no transcendental ego. It is important to note that, although Sartre rejects Husserl's transcendental ego, he still preserves the existence of the empirical ego. To him, like all objects of consciousness, the empirical ego exists, but is constituted as an object outside consciousness. If we remember correctly, Husserl introduced the transcendental ego as a unifier for consciousness in order to justify immanent directedness. Sartre, however, more like Husserl's initial rejection of Kant, finds it unnecessary to introduce such an entity, as he thinks that consciousness itself can perform the job as a unifier. That is, by itself, consciousness can unify all our conscious experiences. However, unlike the transcendental ego, consciousness changes through time and is momentary and not enduring. It can unify conscious experiences only in two ways, either by unifying them as acts directed to the same intentional object, or unifying them within their different internal time duration. With the rejection of the transcendental ego in mind, we can see why Sartre also rejects Husserl's transcendental phenomenological reduction. In Husserl's case, through transcendental phenomenological reduction of the empirical self and all external objects, what was revealed was the transcendental ego. This was the method in which the ego can be established by phenomenological reflection, proving it to be in the data of our experience, and hence acting as a phenomenological datum. This is blatantly what Sartre denies. To him, what remains after phenomenological reduction is not a transcendental ego, but in fact only consciousness itself, which is egoless. Thus consciousness as proposed by Sartre in being and nothingness is in nature nothingness. Sartre then goes on to develop his famous distinction between pre-reflective and reflective consciousness as mechanisms of consciousness in order to show that consciousness is egoless. According to Sartre, when one is totally absorbed in reading a book, and someone suddenly comes along and asks you what you were doing, you can immediately answer that you were reading. This is possible because we have pre-reflective consciousness, or an inner awareness of consciousness of our reading act. This inner awareness is called non-positional consciousness of itself, which in short means self-consciousness. Consciousness is always self-conscious. When being aware of any external object, it is implicitly aware of itself being conscious of that object. We never need to posit ourselves as an object holding a book in order to realize that we are reading. This positing of ourselves as an external object is what Sartre calls reflective consciousness, and it is this type of consciousness that creates the empirical ego as a basis for which the reading act resides. It doesn't take much for one to notice that most of our acts in daily life are pre-reflective in nature. We are self-conscious of ourselves performing certain actions, but within our